Welcome, everyone, to Voices for the Future. I'm Anadea Judith, and my co-host, Michael Wayne, is calling in from upstate New York. And we are delighted today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Richard Flyer, whose work I have, idly been following for many years. And he's just come out with a book, Birthing the Symbiotic Age, an Ancient Blueprint for a New Creation. And I'll tell you a little bit about Richard, and we'll get started. He's a pioneer in the integration of embodied spirituality with the building of bioregional ecosystem networks. Now, we're going to talk more about what that means. Through the Symbiotic Culture Movement, his goal is to activate 50,000 micro-bioregional villages, towns, and cities as community networks by 2033. That's a very ambitious goal. In his new book, Birthing the Symbiotic Age, Richard explains that this is no pie-in-the-sky ideal, but a feet-on-the-ground real deal. It's based on more than 40 years of successful practical application in environments as diverse as Sri Lanka and Western cities like Reno, Nevada. The Sarvodaya movement in Sri Lanka has already activated 5,000 bioregional ecosystem networks, leading the way in this novel approach. And so I can't wait to hear all about what the symbiotic culture is, what's been done, how it works, what it's based on. So welcome, Richard. Really happy.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here with you, Anadea and Michael. Thank you.
Nice so we always start our interviews with getting a bit of the backstory, and perusing some of your book, I saw that there quite is a backstory going back to when you were 12 and you were having these spiritual experiences. So it sounds like that was what gave birth to the work you're doing now. So tell us a little bit about that and how that led to the symbiotic culture work you're doing.
I'll try to keep it brief if I can. I grew up in Alexandria, Virginia, and just a regular middle class, secular Jewish family household. So I had no religious context. So when I was 12, I began to have spontaneous experiences that I could just describe as energetic experiences, but it was also illuminating, awakening in a sense of an expanded awareness, where I was able to experience something that was much bigger than myself, that I felt part of it, I felt connected to it, and then I felt connected to everything. And I go through that and I describe that in more detail in the beginning of the book. So that's how I start that first section of the book, which I call Formation, which has to do with personally, how was I formed in terms of these experiences, and then how those experiences led me to be involved in community. But it also formed me in a sense that I was beginning to have a dissonance when I was a kid. I'd have these beautiful experiences of connection, of love, and it just really opened my heart. And then as a 12, 13-year-old, I just remember with this big open heart receiving the suffering and the pain in the world, like all at once. It just like, I wasn't really in control of it. I didn't know what was happening. I knew that I was opening to something, and that's what, led me to, I mean, it's not morbid what I'm saying, but receiving or being able to connect with the suffering on the planet, and then to some extent making that my personal responsibility, not in a morbid or like a saving the world context, but just I couldn't like separate myself, compartmentalize myself from it. So since then, subsequently over the years, I've had a variety of other spiritual experiences. And then in the book, I chronicle how I started having experiences in nature. I started writing some poetry. I started like as downloads um, of and the experience that led me to see how creation or nature was a reflection of what I call this underlying transcendent reality that I believe that I was experiencing. So I saw the reflection, like a mirroring within nature of some underlying architecture, some pattern, some organizing principle, and how it felt as a teenager was that there was some ground of being, some transcendent ground of being, some pattern, some principle that was bigger than me that I could trust. Like I could literally had an experience that young that no matter what was happening to me or in the world, that I could trust in what I had experienced is real. And it was foundational to my, the way I started looking at the world. And from that trust that I had experienced, I also then felt, I guess you would call it faith. So I didn't grow up in a religious context or a religious frame. And yet there's a parallel in terms of some of the languaging that I'm using. And eventually what was a relationship to this, what some people could call this universal mind, transcendent reality. Over a period of 15 years, that experience actually, through my story that I'm sharing, it became personalized in the form of Jesus. So that was really surprising to me, raised as a secular Jew, studied Tibetan Buddhist meditation in the 80s, lived for a year with a Aztec Indian medicine woman. And then it all kind of, went towards this personal relationship with Jesus. I have no explanation for it. I'm not reading too much into it other than the universal impersonal quote it became a person. So there was a personalization of this transcendent reality, kind of like a gateway or a doorway. So I can communicate with a person, with Jesus, who was like helping me to access these realities. And anyway, I took these experiences and then I began some experiments in building community. So that's the manifestation for me. How do I overcome the separation, fragmentation that I saw within human society that was vastly different than the underlying unity of the reality of the spiritual realm and nature? Why is human society so out of whack, or at least to me at the time? And then I was following the suffering. I was just entering into the suffering and try to understand this, like what's going on? Why is this happening? What can I do about it? Should I do anything about it? So it's like, yeah, it's an ongoing multi-decade process.
Mhm. And along the way, you were trained as a biologist. So Richard, were you able to, because sometimes, science, biology, and these transcendent, mystical, unitive experiences, whatever word phrase you want to use, for some they can reconcile, some they don't, or they have, dichotomies in them. Did they fit together hand in glove right from the start as you became a biologist, or did it take a while to reconcile?
That's a great question. This is the first time anybody's asked me that question, so I'm going to do my best. Um, what was interesting is in the beginning of these experiences around 12, 13, 14, I was looking to the heavens. So I bought a telescope and I was looking and observing the stars and the planets and heavenly bodies. So I was kind of looking outward. And then once I started getting interested in nature and connecting with nature, it was almost like the opposite, like trying to ground that higher, deeper reality by something that I could observe. So yeah, I went into biology because I believe of the love of nature, the connection that I was experiencing that grounded that transcendent reality into something that I could relate to more, physically, and nature provided that. And I went on a series of journeys, not medicine journeys at the time, but I went on a series of outdoor journeys while I was before I got into college. And I made some connections with some teachers at UC Santa Cruz, where I ended up doing my bachelor's. And that's when I really had a love of nature. And instead of I was going to do quantum physics and astrophysics. But then I shifted, and that was that shift away from the telescope and astronomy into nature, because as I developed a love for it. So studying pilot whales, which was the field, and dolphins, it was something that was gradual and natural for me. And I spent about, 8 years researching pilot whales, and I did my research at Catalina Island off Los Angeles in 1981. I lived there for 3 months, living with the pilot whales.
Yeah.
Wow, is that where you got what you call an ancient blueprint for a new creation? That's the subtitle of your book. And so this connection of nature, of course, nature is so much older than we are. It's been doing it for, almost billions of years. So, well, yeah, 3.8 billion years since the beginning of life. So it's got something over us. Is that where you base your ancient blueprint for the new creation?
It's still derivative of something deeper. So the ancient blueprint, you're right, it's found within nature. I've been looking at community movements over the last several thousand years, trying to trace what I call an ancient blueprint. Ancient blueprint, I mean it in the sense that there's some underlying order or pattern in transcendent reality that we're part of, and that we come from that, we emerge from that. However that happens, I'm not here to discuss philosophy or theology or metaphysics. I'm just giving you my own observation of it. Specifically in the book, when I talk about an ancient blueprint, I trace it specifically to the idea of how do we translate or transform, or how do we connect the transcendent reality with the immanent reality that we live in. So when I use the term ancient blueprint, for me, of course, I can go back to indigenous views 30, 100,000 years. Of course, I could do that. But for me, in my own story, it was Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount who talked about loving God and loving others, loving your neighbor. And I began to see that, especially in retrospect, as I'm writing my book and trying to describe a language to communicate this experience, which is that that's what I believe the Sermon on the Mount reflects, which is actually a specific pattern to describe how to bring the transcendent into the world, how to bring heaven to earth. Mm-hmm. So the ancient blueprint is that pattern that's underlying, that precedes humanity, but it also, to me, precedes all creation. And it's a mystery. And I don't claim to understand it, although I'm honoring it.
The idea that we're here to create heaven and earth has always been what I've been about, and that's what I say is our purpose as humans on this planet. And a friend of mine who passed away recently said, we don't need to raise hell to change the world. We just need to lower heaven.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's cute.
Yeah. So the term symbiotic culture, there might be some people who not fully understand what that means. If you could just articulate on it, Richard.
Sure thing. So the idea of symbiosis is an idea that also comes from biology, and has to do with organisms either having mutual benefit, but where there's a win-win in terms of organisms that work together over time. For example, the rhizome network of fungi that are interacting with the roots of trees in a forest, and there's an interlocking connection and communication and a mutual exchange, mutual benefit of nutrients for sugar in terms of energy transfers that's happening. So that's just an example of symbiosis from nature that's mutually beneficial. Of course, there are negative symbiosis, but I'm specifically focusing on mutually beneficial symbiosis. So symbiotic culture then is an extension of that applied to human society, where the idea where intentional, conscious, mutual benefit would become the norm from the level of person to family to neighborhood to community to region to nation to the planet. And it would define a culture where that's normal.
And that's
So
quite an antidote to the survival of the fittest culture of competition and, you know, me, and let me get mine and compete against the other guy.
Yeah, no, that's long standing. In the book, I call that a culture of separation.
Mhm.
And the culture of separation has been with us for thousands of years. And it's not just a Western phenomenon, it's also in the East. But there's this broad, multi-thousand-year pattern, has to do with the way you would see it through history is the rise and fall of empires, which are these dominance hierarchies where people accumulate, financial wealth and then political power, and then also religious power kind of mixed in there. And they've used that to create advantage for themselves and self-interest and keep their sense of power. And it always seems to be the same cyclical pattern of the rise and the fall of empires, because that's not a sustainable pattern. It always just creates social and economic inequality and spiritual and moral decline, because it's separating people from themselves, from nature, and from the transcendent. So I
Do you
call that
see
the
any?
culture of separation. And the antidote I'm calling, or I'm labeling, the culture of connection. So it's kind of a two-way kind of flow.
And when you
Sorry.
study nature, you don't see examples of empire in nature, do you?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot of constraints within nature that have been taken away with humanity. Now, in natural systems, while there's opportunism and yeah, there's not just cooperation, there's predation, there's brutality there. It's in a constraint of a resource and population size that's not as amplified as what humans are capable of with technology. See, technology allows human beings and self-reflected consciousness, the fact that we plan for the future, see the past. This combination of technology and this planning ability means that, like other creatures who are opportunists, it's just accelerated dramatically our capability. So in a sense, we're still part of nature, but we act like we're separate from nature. So it's a paradox. Many people say, well, we're not natural. Well, okay, how is that possible? Our consciousness and awareness, we evolved and emerged from within nature. It's a matter of just, remembering a bigger picture, remembering the transcendent to anchor us, so that we don't keep repeating the same cyclical pattern of rise and fall of empires. So anyway, yeah, I hear what you're saying. It's nuanced about nature is more self-organizing in complex systems where, yeah, you don't get that specific kind of top-down hierarchy. So yeah, you don't need
Not
like
on
a
a large
pharaoh's.
scale, not on a
Yeah,
macro
like
scale. You might get
yeah,
it
like
within a particular tribe or a particular species, but not on a macro scale.
yeah, no, it's true. Like in nature, beautiful creations happen in forest ecosystems, but that's a lot different than having like a pharaoh, getting 1 million slaves to build the pyramids, which is the kind of like that's a whole nother destructive pathway.
Right. It's like in nature, as you said, there are cycles of predation. There are some animals who predate on other animals, but in human society, it's manipulative, so that predation is those who can predate, as you say, Pharaoh society or our contemporary society, divide and conquer those who try to accrue the money, the power through illicit means, whatever in nature. That, a lion is not going to try and gather everything they can to become king of the jungle. It's just laws of the jungle, so to speak. Here, it's a man-made jungle, and
yeah. So cultural evolution accelerates more rapidly, obviously, than biologic evolution. We're talking generational shifts,
yeah,
not thousands or millions of years to create change. So we're just really right now with artificial intelligence, the acceleration of this process of cultural evolution has reached some type of tipping point where we're going to have to, really increase our moral capacity to understand and to control the technology that's emerging from these more primal sense of competition and power dynamics that we have within us. So that has to be balanced. So that's why I focus primarily on the what people might call the polycrisis or metacrisis, all the interlocking crises on the planet, like climate change, wars, economic inequality, hunger, poverty. Those all have a spiritual root foundation. So I believe in the approach that I take is to make the spiritual focus primarily in internal cultivation of virtues as the prime driver for community development and transformation of both person, family, neighborhood, community, and the world. So it's really got to be that basic level. And I think, that's becoming less of a unique idea. It's all in the application. Well, how do you apply it? How do you make that real?
I think you state something I read of yours, that we don't have to, in your opinion, we don't have to fight the existing paradigm. We just start making these connections that are already there, that are natural and wanting to happen, connecting people up within communities. And then it's sort of like what's underneath is pushing the old system out because it's growing to take its place. But it's not a battling, it's just establishing the connections. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. So the old approach to changing society is generally one group dominating another. So it's like some revolutionary process of overthrowing an existing system or pattern, and it just keeps repeating itself. So instead of overthrowing, we need to undergrow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So if you think about it, I mean, humanity now, even though it looks pretty bleak and it seems to me and it feels pretty dark in terms of what's happening, the economic base, technological base, social communication systems are in place through pain and suffering and the material production system of the last several centuries. And yet underneath is this spiritual foundation that is acknowledged by the majority of humanity as important. So the idea of undergrowing rather than overthrowing, it has to do with a combination of honoring that transcendent principle through the virtues. And then once that transformation is maturing within us, we then can become a vehicle to hold space. We can hold space for our local community. And by holding space, I mean that the transformation that happens to us through identifying with the transcendent and these transcendent virtues of love and sharing and generosity and patience and truthfulness and kindness and charity and all those are the main ingredients in order to unite a community. So yes, these powerful virtues give us the capability of uniting a community across the silos. And the silos that exist have been around for a long, long time. And it's the silos that separate us are utilized by political, religious and economic leadership to actually ultimately keep us divided and fighting each other over a variety of issues. So the way to bypass this battlefield of separation to a new playing field is, instead of creating a separate project that itself would become a silo and compete just like everybody is doing today, a new role for building community is emerging, which is to gently connect the existing powers of goodness and the good works that are already happening in the spiritual, social, religious, cultural, economic, and political realm, but locally, where we could relate to it. So the idea of connecting the good that's already in a community into a power to change, it itself becomes the scaffolding to bridge between the current culture and this, quote, future culture. But the paradox is, you can't develop the future culture, won't happen unless you begin to practice it today, right now, at this moment. So that's the paradox. It's being independent of the existing system, but also interdependent with it. So it's not about like forming like an eco village or an intentional community that's separate from the regular community, although that's a good thing to do. And there's millions of people that are interested in that. I'm describing something that's more intrinsic and embedded in an existing community that brings together everybody, not just people that might think about the need for change in a way from like an activist perspective. This is way beyond that. It's a much broader idea. Mm-hmm. I hope that was clarifying.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So I want to read, in your book, you have a quote from Václav Havel. I want to read that and then ask you a question, and you could also comment on his quote. Václav Havel, the former president of Czechoslovakia and the first president of the Czech Republic, he once said, "The salvation of this human world lies nowhere else than in the human heart, in the human power to reflect, in human meekness and human responsibility." So I'd like you to say more about that. It's kind of like, in addition to what you've been saying, and also talk about what a symbiotic community would look like.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. What that quote means to me is, in reflecting on activism that I've been involved with for 40 years. So I've interacted with, I can't tell you how many leaders and networks and groups and social, political, economic movements across the spectrum. What that quote means to me is, in a lot of times when we want to change society, if we don't realize that we have a shadow, an unwitnessed part of ourselves, we could project anger and animosity to others, so that our method of making social change is based on division. So, for example, within the culture wars today in the United States, you've got people that say things like, well, I'm not going to associate with that person. I'm not going to even work with them because they voted for Trump, or I'm not going to work with that person because they voted for Biden, or that person, or this. All these distinctions are the way that the culture of separation operates. It keeps us like that in a matrix of separation. So I interpret Václav Havel's comment, which is, if we're to change society fundamentally, that we need to get off that battlefield where we even look at reality like that, and we begin to look at our own darkness, our own shadow. Not that is shadow is bad or wrong, but the shadow is just the hidden parts, the wounded parts, the hurt, the traumatized parts of ourselves that have been compartmentalized. They rule us if we're not conscious of them. And that's typically, modern social movements tend more often than not to not look at their own shadow. In other words, that social change, even community development, tends to neglect spiritual transformation or personal awakening as part of the equation. It's almost like spirituality is like a private, personal thing, and it's not included in the public sphere. You're not supposed to talk about it. You're supposed to keep it to yourself. Well, what I am suggesting is that not only is that approach not going to lead to what the people think it's going to lead, and I have experience with that and comment on that real lived experience of how that doesn't work. I also have experience building community based on transformation internally, and it looks a lot different. And Sarvodaya is probably the world's clearest example of a spiritually based community transformation movement. And that's why it was really exciting to find out about it 35 years ago. And maybe your second question, Michael, was about what does it look like? I might share a little Sarvodaya about some of the villages and how they work, if that's okay with you. Would that be, did you want to comment on what I just said about that long response
Oh,
on
no, no. It
baklava?
reminded me of another quote from Gandhi, who said, democracy requires a change of heart. So you're right that it's,
well, you know, some of these ideas these aren't like, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to understand these principles. And it's just it's so sad that what humanity generally has known for thousands of years, which is what you're talking about, that there is this ancient blueprint, there is a pattern, there is an underlying moral order that we're part of and that we can participate in, but that's been like forgotten. So what you just said, for many people, it's like, really? No, it's actually on, that's why it's an ancient blueprint. It's an old pattern, but we've got to take that old understanding about the nature of virtue and character and awakening and the need for these very, very basic human development aspects and apply that to how we're organizing society. I mean, it just sounds so ridiculous when I'm thinking about it. It's just, it is obvious, right? That's why I'm not claiming I'm sharing any new ideas with you or in my book. Nothing is new. And I was conscious of that. I'm not here to introduce a new philosophy or new teaching or a new anything. Because
it sounds like you're here to point out what's already been demonstrated and been
absolutely
given.
I'm focusing on, we got to focus on what works. And not mess around with having to think that we have to reinvent new solutions based on some new philosophy or some new, you know, religious idea or some new community idea or economic idea. I always was just fascinated throughout my whole life of patterns. Like, what are these patterns? What has worked before? So I look at that as a lineage. So there's a lineage that I've identified that I talk about in my book that leads to this. And that's what I've been impacted on. So
wonderful. And you had some graphics of that, you know, the love and compassion and integrity. And maybe we could show that up on the screen if that's.
Oh, sure.
Oh, is that the graphic I was showing you?
Yeah, the one, I think you pulled it out of the book, out of the posting. So
yeah, 12 comment note, the shared values.
5 shared values. So this is an example of a pattern. In 2006, on Valentine's Day in Reno, Nevada, we convened a community meeting with almost 100 leaders from different religious, political, business, citizens, activists, really across the spectrum. And we were looking at we had a process of identifying, first of all, whether there was anything that they could agree upon that was the root cause or problem that our community and society faced. And disunity became really a prominent, you know, reason for people to want to focus on it. So people felt that disunity or the lack of unity was the single most important problem. And what we did at that meeting is we identified, gosh, it was like we had these breakout small groups where we identified hundreds of ideas on how to bring the community together. So it was a true example of a collective intelligence. And one of the ideas was to really look and see, are there any universal values? Are there any universal virtues, any universal principles? So we had like a committee and a group of interested residents and others. And we got together and we brainstormed on focusing on values. Now I would call these virtues because that's really what they are. But at the time we called these 5 shared values. So what we did was we identified, I think there's like 35 values, and we came up with 5 categories: love, integrity, courage, service, and respect, with the subsidiary virtues or values within it, as a way of reminding ourselves about how virtues are important for our personality, our character, how virtues serve as an organizing principle. To me, virtues are transcendent energies. The virtues come from the transcendent in a sense that they're coming from an underlying pattern. They themselves, they're intangible, they're not physical, and yet they are embodied and embedded within our awareness and our personality. So they help to organize our personality. And ideally, all of these virtues are practiced in conjunction one with another and another. It's not just one thing at a time. So for example, I know it sounds crazy, but if somebody just was compassionate, but had no wisdom, had no love, had no charity, had nothing, a person who believes that they're compassionate, like they believe that they're helping others or caring about others, they could commit genocide.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Chairman Mao in the Cultural Revolution, from his perspective, was like, promoting, maybe he was thinking he was compassionate, but I didn't sense a lot of love there. So that's why practicing these virtues as coherent constellations is really important. So what I've learned with the Sarvodaya movement in Sri Lanka and later in symbiotic culture is that one of the main foundations for a symbiotic culture is the embodiment of these virtues in practice. So it's all about action. It's not about just some intellectual construct. It's literally action in a community and applying these in real world, anchored in reality. So if you want to know the simple process, I know it just sounds so straightforward, but the basic idea of building a symbiotic community and a network is accessing these transcendent virtues coming through us as human beings. And then those virtues embodied then are transmitted through new network nodes of intersection, the people, the leaders that we're connecting the good around. So you're, in a sense, you're like connecting directly with the transcendent as a person, and then with each other, and then you're then you're transmitting this transcendent power through networks. And that's how you have the uplift. Now, people who are into quantum physics might call that a quantum shift. I'm calling it specifically using other language. I'm trying to make this book accessible to both spiritual but not religious people, but also religious. Definitely, I don't want to use exclusivist language, so I'm doing my best to communicate these concepts more universally.
Yeah, and and you have a chart yourself of a symbiotic food or symbiotic network. Do you want to? Anaday, you had a question?
You have a practical application of how you applied that in the food industry.
Oh, sure thing. It's really, yeah. I'm glad that you asked. Let me see if I could share this. And tell me if you're seeing. Tell me that you're seeing this.
We are.
So the application of how you start with an individual embodying these transcendent principles, these energies, these virtues, getting yourself prepared to unite a community so that you're going beyond any particular narrow agenda that you might be promoting, left wing, right wing, religious, spiritual, any language that you're using or any tribe that you're part of. In order to build community, you have to be able to transcend, but still include those tribal associations. Your identities, your local worldly identities are important. They just can't dominate. So that's the first phase, first step of building a network, is embodiment on the level of a person. So essentially communities that are divided by siloing as almost like a natural state. So siloing, as I spoke of before, is natural, is a feature of the culture of separation. It is a time-tested way of keeping people divided. We don't know any better. So we build organizations typically that are within silos, feeling we have to compete with each other. Even those of us trying to change the world and make the world a better place, unwittingly, we're doing the same thing. So in this case, I'll just kind of go through quickly. This is an example of how you build a symbiotic network in an area of food. And it has to do with the purpose being growing and consuming more food in a local region as the main purpose. And there's many reasons to do that. One is, for those that are concerned about climate, the idea that the average food product has to be traveled in, like 1,500 miles. It's shipped, so it's using fuel to do that. So it's polluting the environment to get to you. So one of the ideas is that you can reduce greenhouse gas production by producing and consuming more locally. Also, economies now have developed centralized food production and centralized economies that are extractive. So they're really creating power imbalances for local communities. Local communities have much less control economically and politically because they're part of larger national, but also global collectives that are really top down, and basically local communities suffer from that. So they lack the capacity for self-sufficiency, and especially in a time of global instability, more and more people are realizing that we really need to get back to a local community level. So one of the ways to do that isn't just to talk about it in general, abstractly, it's to focus on shared needs, and food is one of them. So here's an example where, I'll just kind of go through these are like different aspects of a food system, like restaurants, farming, farmers markets, food co-ops, institutions, people that are hungry. So these are realms where there already are existing organizations and enterprises. There's already farmers, there's already restaurateurs, there's already people who might be, creating food co-ops, regenerative agriculture projects, the myriad, there's a ton of things people are doing. And yet, because of the way our system is, they are fragmented and not collaborating necessarily. So the idea here is to take a common need like food, applying these higher spiritual virtues as a way of building a new culture while you're building an actual practical network at the same time. They're one and the same. It's a lived, embodied process. And the way it's lived and embodied is, so in phase 2, a catalytic connector, a person like any of us in a local community, takes it upon themselves to identify their own food system through research, through mapping. There's a variety of ways to do that. We won't have to get into it. And what they do is they start a series of one-on-one conversations with some of the involved people, the farmers, the ranchers, the restaurateurs, food co-op folks, food activists, people concerned about hunger. Anyway, you start get to know them, and you have one-to-one conversations where you're checking in whether they're in alignment with building a symbiotic culture that's for mutual benefit. They don't have to give up their organization or their power or anything. It's just very informal, but you ask them whether they're interested in forming this broader network. The network itself is not a separate formal organization. It's not like you're forming a new charity. You're not forming a business. You're forming a new, call it a meta network construct, from which a new playing field can emerge. And to do that, you can't be a power hungry person. So if you're somebody looking to make a name for yourself, you're somebody that is like into your own political, religious view, and you don't know better other than to impose that on somebody else, it's just not an appropriate thing. And you're out of action. You'd be incapable of doing something like this. This is a new function to connect the good already happening. It's like a new function that's in evolution, in cultural evolution. I see it as something, a new function developing. So it's very personal. You connect with individual people. Once you identify the right people, then you form a small group, and that small group is a multi-hub network. So these aren't just individual people or leaders. These are people and leaders that actually themselves have networks. So right now, in this case, you have 6 people that probably are connected to 1,000 organizations potentially between them. So you're bringing your networks to the table, and you're doing it organically. This really resonates with in being in the Polynesia area, the Polynesian method of collaboration that goes back thousands of years, the indigenous approach, has to do with the sharing of energy, or mana. So you have to share, you have to break bread individually. So this is not like forming a formal organization. This is more like building spiritual alignment, resonance, and to see if you have some coherence that can develop around this purpose. So then what happens is, once you make it through that phase, which could take a month, then it duplicates. This is the fractal nature of the self-organizing emergent network phase. So there's already been 1 or 2 meetings. This is a 3rd meeting. It's still small. It's not public yet. So now you can kind of see that this is a fractal. It's a geometric pattern. It's not just a geometric pattern in terms of a distributed network expanding and duplicating itself. You're actually also, it's a fractal of the transcendent energies of virtues. So it's a fractal of these virtues. The virtues then are injected into this new developing network where it becomes normal. That's when the mutual benefit becomes normal. It normalizes itself, and it stabilizes as a coherent field. It can happen because I've done it. And then the next phase would be, then you'd have your large meeting. Oop, whoa, oh no. So sorry about that. I lost it. So let me stop sharing. So that's what happens. And then you do this organically, and it happens naturally without force. It's a, people have a beautiful experience, because in our, especially American culture, I mean, people don't have an experience where they feel safe in the community, and like in the broader community, it's like a battle zone where you have to worry about crime. You have to worry about getting, your ideas threatened, whether it's on social media. You got the toxicity there, you got the political polarization. So the idea of holding space for a trusted, safe container where you're actually just connecting the good happening already, and you're leaving all of your bullshit at the door. You literally, that's a guideline. You just literally, if you can't do that, then you can't play. So it's for people that are capable, and they don't have to be some elite or enlightened, just capable of holding space for the virtues and being decent, open-hearted, open thinking human beings that want to come together with others. And they're found throughout community. They're not in any particular tribe or segment. So being able to trust and to know that it's not about selling anything, it's not about politics, religion, or business. It's just this beautiful way of coming together. And that's what I call, I just holding space for the community. So I did that multiple times. I didn't know it at the time what I was doing. I was just following a pattern of what I was learning over the decades, and it was intuitive for me. It's only now, in hindsight, looking back, that I'm writing it down to explain more clearly and specifically, hopefully, so that others could learn and expand upon what they're already doing. All the good works that people that are maybe viewing right now that are already doing. This is like a radical expansion of that work.
Well, what I love about this is it does give something for the average person to do, because what I find is most people that I talk to are aware of the meta crisis, as you say, of all the things that are wrong in our world, and they're going, what can I do? What can I do? I don't know how to get aboard this huge freight train that's heading over the, and stop this huge freight train that's heading over the cliff. So, with your model, it seems like this is giving everyday people a chance to connect within their own communities. So, if you were to step that down even more to people who might be listening on this call or listening to the recording later, what could they start to do in right where they are to begin building this symbiotic culture that you have such a vision of? And I might say,
Well,
as we're coming to the end of the hour, if you have questions for Richard, you can type them into the Q&A or into the chat, and we will get soon to audience questions.
Sounds great. That's a great question. Thank you for asking it. I don't mean to sound self-interested and just promoting my book, but I've structured the release of my book as a weekly series where I am releasing not even a chapter a week. I'm releasing maybe 2 to 3 posts of a chapter. It'll take 3 weeks to get through a chapter. So I'm doing it that way because I am instead of releasing the book all at once, I'm starting a public conversation, and then I'm planning to do some live videos with the readers, where we start building a community around these concepts. So the people who are reading the book, who are interested in doing this in their lives, that we can come together and start building an actual community. At first, it will be global. So that's my approach right now. Is I'm it's been challenging for me to communicate what I've learned over 50 years through 1-hour YouTube videos, posts, articles. It is so challenging. So that's why I've spent like literally the last 3 years trying to get this book together so it's all in one place and it's coherent where it will all make sense. So I guess the answer to the question, what can one person do? I'm offering this book as a vehicle for people to start to resonate, learn about my own journey, and to see how I connected the dots, like personally. So my book is semi-autobiographical. So it's about personal stories in context to ideas and concepts that will allow anybody to do this in their own community. So I guess the answer is, join in and start reading to understand the ideas a lot more. See if this is in alignment with what the audience, what they're already feeling and interested in. I think that's right now. It'll be different once I finish the book. Then I'd probably build a community. There'll probably at that point be a website. There'll be an online community at that time, and it'll be more structure. And then I'd help people to find their scattered brothers and sisters in a community, because that's what it's about. It's about identifying people that are resonating with this purpose, resonating with this life mission, and want to find each other. So I'm going to help them later to do that. Right now, I'm just in the kind of, it's like a 6-month process of releasing the book. And then of course, I'll probably do some quarterly trainings as well. So a little premature right now, but anyway, that's all I can say is, go to the Substack, please sign up, and just start digging in. There's a table of contents, and is that I'm seeing a comment from Fred, but I'll leave it up to you guys what the next step is. Looks like there's already some feedback.
Well, Fred is asking, perhaps you could outline the steps you took in Reno. So you said he was part of your community there, and some of those steps. Michael, did you have something?
Oh, I just before we answer that, Richard answers about Fred's comment. Really, you have a quote from Martin Luther King about serving, and really, what you're getting at, Richard, it's serving others. And I'll read that quote. Martin Luther King had said, "Everybody can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and your verb agree to serve. You don't have to know about Plato and Aristotle to serve. You don't have to know Einstein's theory of relativity to serve. You don't have to know the second law of thermodynamics and physics to serve. You only need a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love, and you can be that servant." So, I mean, that's you quoted Martin Luther King from your book. So I took that. So that's really what you're getting at, Richard, correct?
Absolutely. And it's basically any individual, any of the 8 billion plus people on this planet have access to this power so that they could experience life and reality from that beautiful, abundant place. Like we all have that legacy, that divine connection. And yes, you don't have to be you don't have to be tech savvy. Yeah, you don't have to be like an expert in community or network development. There is no political solution. There's no technical solution. There's no external solution. So I'm trying to encourage a sensibility amongst the audience that they can step up and they don't have to ask anybody for permission. They can just step up and do this and be that person. And I'm trying to give a gentle framework so that anybody could copy and do what I did. So before, when you talked about that audacious goal of 50,000 villages, towns, and cities, the only way that's possible, the only way is if communities are empowering themselves to do that. I'm not going to do that. I'm not even building a global organization that's, quote, formal to do that. It has to be a radically different approach. And that's radically different than any approach that you will see today regarding organizing community through either formal nonprofits or formal training or formal networks or coalitions. All of those, I believe, are from the past. And we need to find a new approach, which actually isn't new. And it's the example again, and I saw Steve's comment about Sarvodaya in Sri Lanka. They've built 5,000 villages, a national network of them that have built networks like this over the last 65 years. So it's real, it's really happening. And people are really having that experience, even though they're in the midst of normal villages, towns, and cities. These villages, towns, and cities have a regular, like a city council. They have a formal government. They have regional and national governments. And yet the symbiotic, or the Sarvodaya, they built these societies in 5,000 of these towns that emerged. I believe, I say the word fractally because it's simultaneous. They emerge because it's a coherent pattern. It's a spiritual coherent pattern that can then emerge and take form in how we build community networks and how we structure that. And that's something that I'm teaching, how to do that, because that's where the real juice is, the acceleration of this. It's not like linear or exponential, 1, 2 to 4, then you get 8, then you get 16. That'll still take hundreds of years. This has to happen simultaneously, emergently. It has to be a pattern that can be recognized and universal. And that's why it's so basic. And that Dr. King quote was so important, because we all have access to that sensibility, that experience. In fact, probably there are hundreds of millions of people living that way. They're just in the existing system and they're scattered. So I'm sharing a method that allows them to come together, find each other in a way that just doesn't reinforce the dominance hierarchies and the competition. That's all I'm offering, is a gentle framework for people who have evolved to the point where they see the need for this. And that's why it can happen in 50,000 towns in 10 years. There's no external organizer, the pharaoh building the pyramids. It's more like nature. Complexity emerging.
Yeah, it sounds beautiful. So this being a program that's called Voices for the Future, if you project out in 10 years and 20 years, what do you see as a positive future for what can be built here?
Wow. Well, first of all,
about heaven on earth, right?
Yeah, no, first of all, I'm not somebody that's kind of I'm not somebody who believes in utopia, even that word. I think people are starting to use the term protopia, which has to do more with a proactive approach rather than a prescriptive, hey, this is what this future looks like. What I'd be happy to see would be that, yeah, there's 50,000 movements like this that are independent and that are emerging, and communities are actually moving towards building their own networks, community networks, These are not just spiritual, social, cultural, these are economic networks. When you build a local food system network, like I shared, that's a marketplace. That's a new marketplace in an entire region that connects everybody and is part of value exchange. So I can imagine thousands of those happening. But what we have right now is we have thousands of years of development of this top-down, let's just call it what it is, a global oligarchy ruled by large companies, national politicians, and world leaders and the United Nations. Like you see, I'm not against the United Nations, but frankly, they're in the way. They're really in the way of this because they represent the old pattern of nations coming together and trying to somehow resolve conflicts between them at the level of the culture of separation. They're in the battlefield. They're in the thick of it. They can't do it. They need the regular people. They need us. And we need to empower ourselves, and we don't need their permission. So we don't look to the UN, don't look to our national leaders, don't look to any other external leaders other than ourselves and our capability. With that mindset and heart set, I believe that since I believe this pattern is universal, archetypal, and it's built in to the nature of reality. That is, it's in alignment, I believe, with how reality is and meant to be. That's why I believe it can happen rapidly and simultaneously. And I call that fractal community empowerment. That's what it really means. I remember once somebody came to me and they said, it was really interesting. After we had built the local food system network, a lady came to me and said, wow, that's amazing what you did. How did you possibly do that? And I said, well, I didn't do that. I got together with one person and then another and another, and we formed a group of 5 leaders, and we formed a network of 5, and then we became 10, and then 15, and then the 15 became 100, and then the 100 leaders in the food system, they themselves represented 500 organizations, you know, that were connecting to the maybe 200,000 people, half the people in that county. Like literally, that's how it happens. I didn't do that. That's the framework change that I'm trying to introduce. And it is so challenging because we're so used to thinking that major change requires technological or organizational structural solutions, you know, like forming a charity or businesses, and you got to raise a lot of money. You have staff and employees. None of that is needed. None of that to do this. And that is so hard for people to believe. I mean, it's just so hard. So that's what I'm sharing, how anybody can do it. I'm hopeful that people will take it upon themselves to start doing it, and then we'll build a network globally where people are co-creating at local levels, but also globally sharing best practices, what they're learning, and we do it together. I don't have all the answers. I have a direction. I know how to start, and I know certain steps. That's my role. My role is transitional, is just to teach people how to start to do this, how to build the scaffolding. I have no idea what's going to happen, you know, in terms of like what kind of economic system it'll be. I don't think about stuff like that.
Well, you call it a culture, and it's like if you're going to culture milk to make yogurt, you just add the starter and then you let it sit there. You don't actually do it. You just, you give it the catalyst and it does it itself.
Thank you for a more eloquent and very simple way of saying what it took me like 5-10 minutes to share. Thank you very much. If I could steal that idea, I'll cite you on it. That's really good.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's really brilliant.
Yeah. So let's go back. Fred had asked or said, perhaps you could comment on or you could outline the steps you took in Reno, where you were, Fred is, and you had something going on there.
Well, I kind of started to do that when I was sharing the infographic, when I kind of, that was actually, it came from a real experience. So I don't know what more details I could add right now, other than what I discovered was that it was a very similar process to build the different networks. You know, 21 years ago, I built a local living economy network, which had to do with the general businesses and nonprofits in the community. So eventually it was more than 500 enterprises and nonprofits together in a network. to create this intentional mutual benefit. The local food system network was another one. We built another network which was around arts and culture. There was another one on neighbors and building neighbor networks. So I am describing each of these networks as part of the story, and that'll be coming in section 2. Chapter 6 is actually on forming the local living economy network. So that story will be coming out in about 3 weeks. And if anybody's interested, I think that might be the best thing to do is read it there to start.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so ultimately, Richard, I mean, what you're getting at is the bottom line is our common ground bond, our bonds that bring us together. That we have more as human beings, we have more in common than not. And it
Yeah.
reminds me of I was having a conversation with someone today who was involved in a documentary film called, I never heard of the film until he was telling me about it. It was called Win a Trip to Egypt. It was a couple of years ago, and it was made by a man who's an Egyptian Canadian entrepreneur. And what he did was he came to the US and he held up a sign at like Trump rallies and places where Christians, especially Christian nationalists went. And the sign said, "Win a trip to Egypt." And at
Yeah.
first, people were like yelling at him, "Get out of here, you Arab," and spitting on him. And then people started asking him, "What is this?" And he said, you will get an all expenses paid to Egypt, and all you have to do is meet with local people there, Muslims, and get to know them. And that the film was about that the people of different faiths and backgrounds met and learned about each other and found what they had in common. And so their commonalities. So that's, really what you're getting at, Richard.
Yeah, and that's part of building the new culture. And you do it in a heart and a head set where you're not opposed to the existing system. Like you have no animosity towards it. It doesn't take any of your energy. You already acknowledge the reality of it and what has happened over thousands of years. We're not going to be fooled again about it being told, oh yeah, it's going to be different, vote for this candidate, that candidate. This is like, okay, come on, we've seen that game for like such a long time. This is about, yeah, exactly, it's about focusing on what we have in common, not on what we are against. And many of the things that people attempt to do in building community tend to be what we're against. And this is exclusively what we are for. And it's clear. We're for these principles, these virtues. These are the needs that we want to address in our community. We want to build a new kind of network to distribute a new kind of culture in our community so we can live a more, creative, safe, abundant, beautiful life. And we can do it now. We don't have to wait for anybody. And that's the attitude that I think will be helpful for people. It's hard to get there because we all have our pet peeves, we all have our things that we don't like or we like, and this has nothing to do with liking anything. This has to do with a fundamental principle of cosmic love itself. From that standpoint, it's about love in this broader sense that we are and can be vehicles for bringing, as I like to say in my book, Saint Maximus the Confessor, the Eastern Orthodox from the 7th century, said, to unite the cosmos in love, that which has been separated, that which has been fragmented. So the purpose is pure. And it is about connecting the good. It's about unification, but not a false unity that has to do with some intellectual construct. It's a living, breathing, embodied way of life. You're choosing to live that way, and nobody can stop that.
Oh, that's a beautiful, beautiful note and vision to end on. Any final comments, Michael?
No, I think it really was a very eloquent everything you just said and everything. Yeah, we have work to do, but it's we all have to come together to do it. A rising tide lifts all boats, as the famous phrase says.
Mhm.
And I think as the dominant paradigm is crumbling, that some of this will happen by itself too, because we'll have no choice but to rely on our neighbors and local community and do what we can. Just yesterday, and it gave me so much joy to do so. I have some fruit trees on my property that are producing more than I can eat, and so I picked it all and I took it into the local food bank and had ripe, juicy, organic fruit. Here, take it, and it's going to go to people that need it. And it just really felt good to do that.
Yeah, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. See how it's so straightforward. It's very simple. It's makes us feel good. Just imagine that the forces of a new culture, it already is happening in each community. They're like these threads of,
We
let's
just
just
need to
call it
connect the dots. The dots are
yes,
already there.
it's a countercultural movement that's really, to some extent, without knowing it, is resisting the tendency towards this global kind of machine-like civilization to regiment us. People are responding from their own vantage point. So you might have people in the regenerative community responding already, and they're doing things. You've got spiritual but not religious folks, for example, like the Holo movement and others that are looking to develop, their own kind of flavor, if you will, of a movement. You even have Christians that are back to the land movement, like Christians that are wanting to, resist the tendency towards secular kind of anti-Christian views. So you have all these threads, but right now they're not connecting. It's because of it's our tribal sensibility that keeps us locked in, and tribes eventually become silos, compartmentalizing information and resources. So part of the task of symbiotic culture and a person who's doing this kind of work, yes, is to identify all the threads and then slowly weave them into this beautiful tapestry.
Eloquent, beautiful. The dots are already there. We just need to connect them.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Richard Flyer. And how do people find you?
I think the simplest way is go to Richard Flyer, all one word, .substack.com. And that's where I'm releasing the book. Please feel free to go there. That's richardflyer.substack.com. And there you can go right there at the top of the front page. You'll click on it, and it'll go right to the table of contents. You could read a synopsis. You could read a summary of the strategy, and then it goes right into the book, like literally hyperlinks, and you could read the book at your leisure. And it's also on Spotify, and I've got voiceover on most of the posts, so you can listen to it. You can also, connect on Spotify, where you can catch up and listen to this as well.
And you got
Symbiotic Culture on
and
Spotify.
illustrations, and it's really an enjoyable read. Yeah.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Thank you
so much. Thank you so much
So-
for coming on the show. And who do we have next, Michael?
April 18th, Christina Donnell. She's a psychologist who's also written about her own shamanic healing experiences.
And she works with language.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Richard, for bringing us
Thank you so
some
much.
taste of the symbiotic culture that we can stew in and carry your vision outward. And you can find him at richardflyer.substack.com. And thank you for making the world a better place.
Thank
You too. Thank you, Michael and Anadea. Thank you so much for all you're doing. And I appreciate helping me get the word out, because I'm just starting, and it's really pretty awesome. So thank you.
All right.
Okay. Peace out.
Bye-bye.